There was nothing on this planet that engages the general public more than a good story. However, there are multiple ways to interpret what makes a good story. There are good stories, and there are good stories behind the good stories. Ideally, journalists should be telling the stories of the behind the scenes with an objective viewpoint and critical thinking, leaving sensationalism and imagination to the filmmakers. Most of the time, this is not the case. Journalists can inject as much creativity into their articles as filmmakers would for their films, even though they're supposed to be factual based.
But it didn't happen,
man. According to bull you read on the World Wide Web of bull.
Many film and television sets have all kinds of chaotic events to have reportedly happened. But the only film that Yale journalists have reported to not just be chaotic, but the most horrifying film set of all time, is the timeless classic The Wizard of Oz. Things have been reported such as suicides, murder, attempted murder, abuse, discrimination, drugs, and all kinds of bizarre, appalling accusations. The general narrative is that the set was horrible for everyone, especially for Judy Garland. What if I told you this was not true? Not only the cast and crew looked back fondly of their time making the film, but the set overall wasn't much more troubled than the average film production, even by today's standards. I'd imagine you'll need some convincing. So what is Yale journalism? By definition, they are journalism and associated newspapers that present little or no legitimate, well-researched news, whilst instead using eye-catching headlines for increased sales. So are the myths around this film set nothing but good stories for increase in views? Let's find out. Because I am going to tell you everything that Yale journalists continuously refuse to show you when they describe the Wizard of Oz set as a horror production. Here are our credible sources, documents and perspectives of the cast and crew, mainly explored through the accounts of Emmy Award-winning and premier historian of Judy Garland and the Wizard of Oz, John Fricke, award-winning historians J. Scarfone and William Stillman, and award-winning historian Eugene Harmitz. I have also collected a lot of information from the accounts of Judy Garland's children, Liza Minnelli and Lorna Laft, as well as a variety of other perspectives. Let's get into it. Claim: The Snow was asbestos. The Wizard of Oz is a 1939 film production, so believe it or not, technology and safety precautions weren't up to scratch at the time. Safety measures are being updated all the time, so it's important to not incorporate the knowledge of the present into the perspective of people from the past. Is a film from 1939 having dated safety practices really an appalling fact? But with all that said, the snow in The Wizard of Oz was not asbestos. The snowstorm was actually made up of gypsum. Yeah, this stuff. The snowstorm was made from crushed gypsum, as it is a method that links back to the silent era of filmmaking, although inhaling it too deeply could prove hazardous to actors. Gypsum can potentially may cause irritation to the eyes, sensitive skin, or respiratory system, but it is classified as not dangerous, as there are no long-term side effects. However, they did use asbestos in some instances, such as when Scarecrow was getting lit on fire. It was to protect Ray Bolger from burning his arm, because that was the best way to do it for its time, as asbestos, even now, is still considered fireproof. Despite what you've maybe been told, asbestos is not some rare material that's been banned for centuries, and along came MGM, who decided to dump asbestos all over the actors because they loved torturing them or something. This is not true because, for one, there were films that did use asbestos as snow, but The Wizard of Oz was not one of them. And two, asbestos is more common than you think. Even these days, you can find it in many common items, such as dust connectors, cement, cigarette filters, ashtrays, and makeup. Yeah, makeup. Unfortunately, asbestos has been detected in children's makeup in recent years, as well as toys and fingerprinting kits. We still don't even know how to handle asbestos properly now, yet we make a big deal about people using it a century ago. So in short, asbestos was only involved when it was more safe to use it than not to, and the snow itself wasn't even asbestos at all. Judy Garland giggled on set and got slapped for it. This story is true. However, very few address what happened before and after the slap. Here's the full story. As from what John Lee Mahan recalls, Vic was a wonderful man, and this proves it. When Dorothy first met the Cowardly Lion, she slapped him, and she was supposed to keep on after him. Instead, Dorothy burst out laughing, and they couldn't get her to stop laughing. Finally, Vic took her behind one of the trees. Now listen, darling, this is serious. And he slapped her face hard. And he said, go in there and work. They did it in one take of the scene. He said, cut, marvelous. Then he turned to me and said, I wish you'd hit me in the nose and break it again. I said, why? Because of what I did to her. Garland evidently went up to Fleming and overheard him. She said, I won't do that, but I'll kiss your nose. And she kissed him right on the nose. The stars' relationship continued on that happy plane. He affectionately nicknamed her Judlin. The rest of the cast also remembered fondly of Fleming, as he was understanding, sensitive, kind, according to Jack Haley. And according to Ray Bolger, everyone loved him because he was such a good director. Here's the thing, this is not that, but that is not this. Like many of the stories behind The Wizard of Oz, the situation is a little more complex than a horror story. It's a yellow journalist thing to focus on just this part of the story, and make up the context into something a little more clickbaity. Hence why many people are aware of the slap, but not much else about the situation. Not to mention, she is visibly cracking a smile in the final film.
Is my nose bleeding?
Well, of course not.
Clearly, she was having an awful time on set. So yes, Judy kept giggling, Victor slapped her, she forgave him, then they got along for the rest of the shoot. It doesn't really fit the horror theme, does it? The claim is that there was a pay discrimination amongst the cast. More specifically, Judy had the lowest pay amongst the cast due to sexism. Toto was paid too much for a dog salary, and the Munchkins were financially abused because of their low pay. Take into account, the money an actor earns on a film set isn't an indication of how much they're worth as human beings. The money reflects the value of their contract, which is influenced by multiple factors. Firstly, let's talk about Judy's sexist pay. I have seen articles from professional writers that claimed MGM was a sexist hierarchy simply based off of Judy's pay. Minus Toto, Judy received the lowest pay of all the main cast, including the females. So sexism clearly did not contribute to Judy's pay, professional journalists. But why was her pay relatively low despite being the lead? Despite her talents, she didn't have the star power nor experience to be paid as much as her older co-stars. Also, like other actors' contracts, her pay didn't come from The Wizard of Oz specifically. When Judy signed on to MGM in 1935, she signed a 7-year contract with the intention that she would turn into a star by the end of this period. The first 6 months, she was making $100 a week, then the money built up over time until she was making $500 a week during 1938, which just so happens to line up with The Wizard of Oz production schedule. For the last year of her contract, she was going to make $1,000, but they renewed her contract, instead giving her $2,000 a week for at least the next 3 years. The reason for a large salary increase was likely because she officially became a movie star during the production.
And then that Christmas, they gave Judy her own private dressing room on wheels. And we were part of that because that morning when she came to work and we were at work, they had this dressing room kind of over in the corner, kind of veiled over, like they had this big red ribbon. And when she came on the set, they took her over and they, hollered Merry Christmas, and they gave her the scissors and she cut the ribbon.
So she was making money appropriate for her age and status at the time, and not even too long after The Wizard of Oz, her income became comparable to her co-star's salary. Now, Toto the dog. Do people think this is actually what happened back in the day? Toto, who was a female Ken named Terry by the way, she didn't receive that money, her owner Carl Spitz did. The role for Toto was the hardest cast member to find, as they searched hundreds of dogs across the country, but they realized they didn't actually need to search that far. With years of experience, Carl Spitz worked as a dog trainer, and they brought him in to audition Terry. Instantly the higher-ups hollered, "That's the dog we want." Carl Spitz was also on set giving Terry silent hand signals, so that she would follow cues during shots. So no, the dog didn't get an enormous pay. Her owner got reasonably paid for his efforts. And as for the Munchkins, technically they were underpaid, but not for the reasons you may think. Leader of the Singer Midgets, Leo Singer, was employed by MGM to find as many little people as he could. Singer, however, overpromised and underdelivered to the little people.
We were all supposed to get $100 a week, but Singer swallowed $50 from all of us, and all we got was $50 a week. He swallowed the rest.
Keep in mind though, the Munchkins are an iconic but a minor role compared to the leads. $50 a week for those roles at the time, the money was more appropriate than you may think. Not to mention, MGM accommodated for them. What have we learnt? There wasn't really a pay discrimination. Just like every pay, Judy's contract reflected her age and experience at the time. Toto's owner got reasonably paid for his work. The Munchkins' pay was cut down because of the boss. But not only that wasn't MGM's fault, it didn't bother the little people much.
But then at that time there was very little taken out because you didn't have Social Security, you didn't have a lot of other things to take out of your check, so you received most of that check.
I think I got $75 a week. I was one of the highest paid.
I think the best example to show how complex contracts can actually be is by comparing the salary of the two tin mans working for MGM at the time. Jack Haley made $3,000 a week, whilst Buddy Ebsen was initially only making half of that.
3 dirty hams.
The claim is that Judy Garland's co-stars were awful to her on set, and the evidence being she would tell a story of how her co-stars pushed her out into the skipping sequence on the Yellow Brick Road. The implication being they wanted to take Judy's spotlight away from her by pushing her out of view of the camera.
But whenever we do that little dance up the Yellow Brick Road,
yeah, I remember that.
I was supposed to be with them.
Yeah,
you know,
they crouched out.
They'd shut me out. They'd close in, and the three of them, and I would be in back of them dancing. I wasn't good enough, you know, to say, wait a minute. Now, and so the director, Victor Fleming, was darling man. He was always up on a boom. Would say, hold it, you 3 dirty hams! Let that little girl in there.
One thing I have learned from watching Judy Garland's interviews is realizing how funny she was, which many people surrounding her life have pointed out multiple times.
You were saying how smart she was.
My mom was incredibly smart, and you know what else was wonderful about her, which I wanted people to really, really grasp? She was really funny. She was really funny. All right, she was truly hilarious.
Very dark. She had a very dark sense of humor.
Yes.
She had the tendency to exaggerate or even completely make up stories that didn't happen, including about events on the Wizard of Oz set. According to Eugene Harmon's account, Judy found it necessary to reinvent moments of her past to suit her needs and anxieties. They provided her with some kind of relief, which is backed up by encounters Judy had with psychologists. But according to Liza Minnelli's account, it was actually her way of getting across a joke.
Our mother had an amazing sense of humor, and anybody who really knew her knew what a funny, bright, witty raconteur she was, and her vocabulary was immense. And she had a way of telling a story. She could change anything. So anything that she talked about would become an epic joke, almost. And we used to love to listen to her. And she did that several times, telling stories about the Wizard of Oz. And they have since passed into myth. I mean, people believe a lot of the things that she has told, which in fact, we know are not true.
According to Gerald Frank's account, Judy was not an accurate source with respect to herself. She exaggerated outrageously, invented gleefully, and over the years changed her stories. They were performances too, and she aimed to please and to entertain. There was no doubt that Judy Garland lived in her own special world of fantasy. Telling stories, making up stories was a good part of her life. Living itself was to her a marvelous and exciting adventure, but at the same time, in its own strange way, a journey involving nameless, awful terrors. And with her ingenuity and antic humor, she could fit whatever happened, however harrowing, into that adventure. With that in mind, what do you think this moment really was? She clearly said it in an over-the-top and humorous tone. She then laughs and everyone else starts laughing.
Hold it, you 3 dirty hams! Let that little girl in there.
Watch any of her interviews. In good nature, she's always cracking a funny joke where she can, even if it's sometimes at the expense of her friends, herself, or even the talk show hosts.
What you doing?
Did you ever hear of a man named Owen McGivney? No, you're much too young. Everybody's much too young. Even you're much too young. Owen McGivney.
We didn't, neither one of us grew very tall. They worked us so hard, we became munchkins.
This story in particular might have had some truth to it though, as in the film, you do see how crowded it gets towards the end of the shot, but ironically, they are pushing Judy towards the camera, not away from it. The bulky costumes and the road being noticeably more narrow towards the end likely contributed to the overcrowding. Out of context quotes such as this makes people believe no one on set liked Judy, the only exception being Margaret Hamilton. Despite her on-screen wickedness, Margaret Hamilton was generally known for being a really nice woman, and Judy has mentioned that it was hard to be afraid of her on-screen because of how nice she was off-screen. But this has been twisted around to make it look like Hamilton was the only nice person to her on set. In an interview with Hamilton, although very briefly, they bring up the friendship with the others.
Oh, darling. Now, what is the show?
Well, the show is Come Summer, and it's starring our old friend Ray Bolger.
Oh, what's he doing away?
Well, he's doing a lovely New England character in it.
Judy was given a copy of The Wizard of Oz inscribed by the cast and crew. Ray Bolger even wrote his admiration for Garland as an actress, a little lady, and a lot of fun to work with, lots of love and success. Judy and Ray especially remained close friends over the years, as he was even invited onto her show, in which they talked about all the good times they've had on set.
Oh, you were beautiful. What are you talking about, Delmar? What do you mean, fat little girl? You were absolutely gorgeous. Can we take a picture of that? Put a leash on me and take me home.
And even did a reprise of the deleted jitterbug scene. And no, this wasn't for publicity. Their friendship was also off camera. It has been since The Wizard of Oz, as evident by old rare footage that wasn't initially intended for public release. The camaraderie was actually good all around amongst the main cast. I would go into specific detail about the pranks they pulled on each other, the quips Garland and Jack Haley shared, the things the boys did that made Garland laugh, the prank Haley pulled on La and how he got his payback, Ray Bolger's gift to Judy Garland, the banter overall, etc. But I think I'll sum it up with this. When Buddy Ebsen was still among the cast members, he and Judy were practicing an eccentric dance routine that called for an exchange of slaps on the back. When Ebsen, encased in his sweltering Tin Man costume, enviously appraised Judy's thin gingham frock, Judy was quick to retort, "You big softy, you ought to try to get in your back slaps when you've got a sunburn like mine." During breaks, Lara, Bolger and Haley instructed Garland on what they termed balladry of Broadway, while she in turn gave them pointers on swing singing. People believed Judy Garland worked 72 hours straight, was put to sleep for 4 hours with shots and drugs, to then be woken up and put back to work with the help of more shots and drugs.
And in those days, you worked 6 days a week, and Mickey Rooney and I, for instance, would work sometimes 72 hours at a time.
I only found this quote from Judy's IMDb page, but just based off of this, it doesn't even mention anything about shots, and it's heavily implied that everyone experienced this, not just Judy Garland or the Wizard of Oz cast, but MGM as a whole. Let's just say that this was referring to the cast specifically on the Wizard of Oz. I believe this was another tall tale from Garland anyways, because no one worked 72 hours straight. The schedule was around 6 AM to later in the evening, each day for 6 days a week. Due to child labor laws, Judy was legally required to have a maximum of 8-hour days, in which 3 of those hours were schooling, and 1 was given for recreation, so she only worked on set for 4 hours a day, not the other way around. Even just thinking about it, what is the point of the drugs if the shots were controlling her energy and sleeping habits? And as a film actress, how could she be on set for 72 hours at a time, when all the other cast and crew members would be asleep not operating the equipment, unless they worked 72 hours straight with her? But as far as I know, Judy is the only one to claim the schedule, and it's contradicted by other accounts more consistent and realistic. I wonder why Judy would say something like this.
And they have since passed into a myth. I mean, people believe a lot of the things that she has told.
Oh yeah. How did anyone believe this in the first place? The myth is that someone hung themselves on set, and it was recorded during the take, which ended up in the final film. No one noticed this or pointed it out at the time, but someone did decades later, and when they did, MGM tried to cover it up. There's also like a million other variations, but this is the main gist.
It's not on every copy. You have to have the collector's editions. This is the one you want to own because this is the only place to actually see the original hanging Munchkin footage. This is the suicide of the anonymous Munchkin. Never been identified, never will be. There! Dead. His neck is snapped instantly in a hanging, so...
Everyone apparently has seen or even owned the original tape, but no one can provide evidence. Well, I can. That is creepy. Yeah, I believe I found the original. For a bit of context, The Wizard of Oz was a hit at the time of its release, but it didn't receive its widespread popularity until it started doing its annual television reruns from 1959 to 1991. This was how most people were exposed to the film for the first time. But back then, up until the 1970s when color TVs were more affordable, the standard for watching the film was on a black and white, low quality TV. Only a relatively few people saw the film on the big screen, where the quality was decent, because there were fairly long gaps between theatrical reruns. I say this because the object swinging side to side is actually the bird just moving around a little behind the tree. I took this from a 1955 release trailer. All I did was desaturate it and add a bit of grain, so it matches closer to what many people at the time would have seen. It's much harder to make out what's in the background. What I suspect happened was some people with the low quality television at the time, who didn't know anything about the Wizard of Oz, and therefore the context of the scene, misinterpreted this shape and thought it was a stagehand or some kind of mistake. Unfortunately, I can't confirm this 100% as it is a bit speculative, but it adds up, and it explains why a lot of people think they really saw something, but not a shred of evidence can be found anywhere, outside of weak testimony. Some might say it doesn't matter how bad the quality was, the wings should have been noticeable anyways, but here's the thing, the theatrical reissue trailer, that was likely many people's first exposure to the Wizard of Oz, it doesn't reveal the bird's wings at all. Not because the bird is fake, but because the trailer fades to the next shot before the bird gets a chance to show off its wings. Was it really the unlucky timing of a fade cut that convinced people that there were different versions of the shot? And if it dissolved after the wings popped, it could have stopped a long history worth of questionable theories? Now the big question is, if it was a bird, why? Why was a bird on set? It looks too big to be a bird. Big birds do exist, unless you think these guys are fake. This bird in particular is called a crane. They had all kinds of birds on the set, big and small, including a bird that's just barely visible behind the shed. They did this to keep in with the spirit of the original story, and to make the set look more like an outdoors environment. And no, none of these are fake, because there's even a shot of Judy Garland and Ray Bolger in character, staring and pointing at a bird. How is this not proof that there were birds on set? But Ray Bolger falling and Judy looking at the Tin Man is proof that there was a hanging corpse behind them, despite the fact they do those scenes throughout the movie. Even if you are still convinced that she was not looking at the Tin Man, I'll raise you the fact that there were crew operating fans and equipment on the side in order to get these leaves blowing, kind of like how later they would do the same with these poppies. She was looking at the Tin Man, but if she wasn't, she was likely distracted by the crew on the side. Because either way, she is clearly looking to her left, not behind her at an imaginary corpse. Also, how did she see a dead body behind her? But all the crew couldn't see anything when it was right in front of them for like 30 seconds, not including the long amount of time it would have taken to set up and rehearse a shot. There have been so many other theories, like apparently there was a dead Munchkin somewhere on the Yellow Brick Road or the Munchkin set. I don't get it. But get this, according to John Fricke, the myth started around the 80s and developed over time.
I can tell you that legend goes back to at least the 1980s. It went from being a stagehand caught on camera to a stagehand who was depressed and hung himself on camera, to an MGM executive who was so despairing of how much Wizard of Oz was costing that he hung himself on camera, to an actress who hung herself because she didn't get the part of Dorothy, to a Munchkin who hung himself because Judy Garland wouldn't date him.
Whilst according to the late Jerry Marin, the myth started around the 70s. It just so happens that not only color televisions were more affordable by the 70s in America, there was a book in the late 70s called Murder on the Yellow Brick Road, where apparently a Munchkin was actually murdered on set, and everything had to be quiet whilst an investigation was carried out by Toby Peters. Except this is fake. Toby Peters is a fictional crime series written by a fictional author. So the Hanging Munchkin myth and other variations are just rumors that started with illusions that developed over time into an out-of-control myth. It started to pick up in the 70s thanks to people's imaginations. The crane wasn't added into the film after the fact. It once was actually in a sense edited out, which likely started the confusion in the first place. I've also just recently stumbled upon a comment saying that they noticed the myth pick up around the 50th anniversary for the film. It just so happens that they released this trailer again at the time to celebrate the occasion.
Here is the original Wizard of Oz coming attractions trailer, produced by MGM for its 1955 theatrical reissue.
With all this, I am confident in saying that the Hanging Munchkin is just an illusion, contributed by the fact that 20th century TVs were crap. The bird was hiding behind this tree, and the most noticeable feature about the bird was not shown in the trailer released in the 1950s and the 1980s. A depressed Munchkin, Judy's lover. I could not care less what made up backstory you have for this myth. There's no evidence that it happened in the first place. Until... Alright, I'm calling Suicidal Munchkin Steve because I can't be bothered saying Suicidal Munchkin every 5 seconds. In 2011, the Hanging Munchkin myth started to really become popular when Steve made 2 videos. The first one is of him putting in the VHS tape and showing the Hanging Munchkin. This is completely fake. The screen has been altered in editing, as evident by the numerous shoddy edges of his fingers and the VHS tape when they all move in front of the TV screen. Not to mention, the reflection of the VHS tape does not match the color of the screen, and there are moments where the screen does not match up with the TV edges. The TV is clearly moving, but the film is completely still. It's basically a somewhat subtle version of me doing this. His other upload was a screen recorded version. It's also fake. Considering the shape and color patterns, the Munchkin is actually a still frame of the coroner from the movie. Steve removed the details, making him look really dark and blurry. I've pointed out multiple other things in my previous video, but the main thing to note is that the Tin Man's axe has not been cropped well as it passes over the Munchkin. Here's where things get a little complicated. His upload is supposedly the same video being zoomed in a few more times, but they are actually all slightly different edits. I think it's likely he was just having a lot of fun editing, and he made multiple versions trying to improve his skills. In the first shot, the axe is poorly cropped in the middle. In the second shot, he just duplicated a chunk of the axe and put it over the gap. In the third shot, he tried recropping it, but the outline of the original axe is visible. In the final shot, he cropped it a lot better, except for this random sharp bend on the lower part of the axe. This has other editing mistakes because, it's fake. Over the years, there have been multiple YouTubers uploading Munchkin videos. Alice used Steer's video as evident by the watermark, so it's just a copy. Keep in mind as well that she also adjusts the footage like this for some reason. Eric cropped the watermark and did his own color grading. Roberto uses Alice's video as evident by how the footage is adjusted. The Horror Shack, or whomever he took this video from, he used the same watermark cropping method. However, he also shows this version and has no watermark. That's because he took this footage from Steve's first part, so he just cropped out the watermark again. He tried fixing the axe, but it also looks off compared to the film, and he didn't fix any other editing mistakes. Bad Boy took Alice's video evident from the footage adjustment. Derek's video has the same watermark cropping method, and Mr. AVGN is a re-upload of the whole thing. There are those that claimed I made all this up in my last video. Well, guess what? I recreated this video exactly how he would have done it. The bird was actually not hard to get rid of. He created a plate with the bird edited out, and with the Haney Munchkin swinging next to the trees. He tracked the plate over the bird to cover it up. He tried to crop the characters as they go over it. He exported the whole thing in low quality, and voila. If you still don't believe this is my version, here, I'll make it a little more realistic. And yes, this is possible for 2011 standards. The main thing he would have needed to get this to work was motion tracking, which has been available on After Effects since 1995. The plaything is also why the tree disappears, and you can see the bird's wings spread out outside of the plate. I'm not even the first one to point out some of these mistakes. There are those that claim to have the original Haney Munchkin tape, but they always refuse to provide the evidence. And the people that actually do show the 1980s original VHS copy of the film, it always turns out to be a bird.
Alright, get it. Right over in this general area. It's a bird! Look, it is the bird!
I am so done with this myth. Yeah, nah, this is pretty awful. Margaret Hamilton was indeed burned badly on set when she was doing the smoke stunt in Munchkin Land. The fire went off too soon and she ended up with 2nd degree burns on her face and 3rd degree on her hands. This is actually pretty bad. Moving on. However, even though this on its own is actually bad, some decided this wasn't horrible enough and they needed to spice things up more. Thanks to one particular YouTuber, some have spun around the idea that they knew the stunt wasn't safe, but they let Hamilton get burned anyways. For fun, I guess. Essentially, attempted 2nd degree or 3rd degree murder. That's a pretty extreme accusation. When she recovered, she supposedly said she didn't want to do the film anymore, but they threatened and blacklisted her, and she had no say on the matter. I've genuinely seen variations of this narrative spread around. Let's actually review what really happened. According to Margaret Hamilton, I had to back away from the good ferry and land on this little piece of flooring on top of the elevator. I had to land exactly because if 1 foot were over the space, I would have broken the leg when the elevator went down. We practiced and practiced until I got it so I could land exactly. After being given last minute instructions from director Fleming, the first take went like clockwork. Fleming thought the shot was perfect, but he wanted to get another take for insurance. Unfortunately, because it was 1 o'clock and everyone was hungry, they decided to have lunch, and when everyone got back, everyone was so full of food and sleepy, nothing went right. The 2nd and 3rd takes didn't work out, and with Fleming's impatience and anxiety kicking, there's no excuse for this. The minute she gets her foot on, Margaret Hamilton interrupts and points out she wanted to make sure both feet were on, and he responds, yes, of course, but I want this shot done right and done right now. From how Hamilton describes it, this time the smoke and the flames came up too quickly.
And it went just like clockwork, and that's the one you see. The first one we did. Then we came back from lunch, and everybody again is tired. It was all just one mistake after another. And I stepped down, the smoke all came up, and I went down. And as I went down, got opposite the floor, and this is the thing that's so astonishing to me about fire, how quickly it takes such a terrible toll. I felt just something warmth on my face. And then there were some droppings, things burning, and I thought, what in the world is that? And of course what had happened was that my broom and the hat had caught fire, and the firemen were putting it out. I had a wonderful young man, Jack Young, who really saved my life. When I was brought up out of the floor, they helped me up out. He was right there and grabbed a hold of me, and we ran to the first aid station on the set, and where he began working on my face to get the makeup off. And of course, it was what was happened. We didn't know this until really the next day, but I had a second degree on my face and third on my hand, one hand. But we weren't sure what. They bound both hands up, and my entire face was finally. And after he got the makeup off, which was very traumatic for me because it was fraught. It was just it hurt so much. I was just, you sort of tremble. You just can't help it. I was just shaking with it.
Because of the accident, she didn't return for 6 weeks. Hamilton returned to work. She was willing to continue working until she was told the next shot involved fire. She refused to do it. Hamilton exclaimed, "I'm not suing you because I know enough about this business to know I won't work again if I do sue, but I won't go near fire again." They initially didn't take her seriously, but she continues, "I have a little boy and I'm his sole support, and I do not intend to do anything to jeopardize my life further." They came to an agreement. They disconnected the pipe off of the boom, eliminating any chance of fire, and Betty Danko, Hamilton's stunt double, instead would do the wide shot with the pipe connected. So that's the full story. A somewhat different perspective on how some portray the story, huh? So they practiced and practiced until everything was perfect, and Fleming gave Hamilton some useful safety tips. The first shot was a success, but after lunch, everyone was full and tired, and they couldn't get the shot right. After mistiming with the fire, Hamilton got severely burnt and went to the hospital. She didn't sue not because MGM threatened her, but because she wanted to work again. She was actually willing to continue working on the film. The only issue she had was fire-related stunts. The idea that the filmmakers knowingly burnt Hamilton is dumb. The only reason why some may say they knew an accident was going to happen, I think, is because Fleming did appear to rush the take towards the end. Obviously, Fleming's impatience and anxiety didn't help the situation, but that's not the same thing as knowingly burning someone. What an awful thing to say. When you take everything into account, with all the practice they did, the safety tips by Fleming himself, the fact that the shot was perfect before launch but nothing worked right after launch, it's obvious Hamilton's accident was influenced by multiple factors. This isn't some fantasy about a deranged villain that wants to kill actors for fun. I mentioned before Fleming was a kind, sensitive man, but even if he was a straight up mustache twirling villain, why would he or anyone want to see Hamilton get burned? Even the most cruel person on the planet would realize getting actors killed would be a huge waste of money for multiple reasons, regardless if the actor pressed charges. Hi, Future ALC here. There was another possible reason to why some say MGM knew that there was going to be an accident that I completely forgot about. Regarding the skywriting fire stunt, in this exchange between Margaret Hamilton and MGM representative Mr. Weeks, it starts out with him saying he doesn't anticipate any fire, and then in the last sentence it says, well, Weeks admitted he supposed that if he stuck tissue paper into the pipe, it might burn. This is not the same thing as knowing a stunt was going to go wrong, especially when it says, well, Weeks admitted he supposed that something could happen. This indicates that this possibility of a danger was a hypothetical he thought about in the moment as he was talking with Hamilton, not a dangerous secret that he was intentionally trying to keep from her. These days, every single plane ride you go on, airlines go through all the safety protocols with their passengers, and although rare, sometimes planes do end up malfunctioning, which leads to a water landing or even a crash. When that happens, that doesn't mean airlines knew something bad was going to go wrong. Airlines can do the best they can to make a plane safe. That doesn't mean there'll never be a danger by going up thousands of feet in the air. MGM could have made the stunts as safe as they possibly could. That doesn't mean something still couldn't go wrong, especially with something as unpredictable as fire. That's why they're trying to give Hamilton a fireproof costume so that she would be safe regardless. Betty Danko, Hamilton's stunt double, took over for the stunt for the wide shots, and she did end up getting hurt from it. They activated smoke coming out of the boom twice successfully, but on the third attempt it exploded. It doesn't say why it exploded, just the fact that Danko blamed Victor Fleming because he wanted to experiment with the shot so that Danko's cape could be flying against the fans, instead of taped down covering the pipe. Obviously it didn't work out, except they did take safety precautions and try to make the pipe fireproof. So are the accidents a result of abuse, or filmmakers doing what they can with 1938 knowledge and resources? Take it how you will. People actually think Buddy Ebsen nearly died from the makeup they were using on The Wizard of Oz. They're right. The makeup did nearly choke Ebsen to death. According to Ebsen himself, the production had been underway for 10 days. One night after dinner, I took a deep breath and nothing happened. It felt like no air reached to my lungs. An ambulance took me to a hospital. I wondered if I was dying. His lungs were indeed coated by the aluminum powder that had been dusted onto his tin makeup. Ebsen recalled that MGM kept trying to call him whilst he was in the hospital. It seems they couldn't understand that an actor could get sick. So clearly, this is an example of MGM and the crew not taking safety precautions. The higher-ups thought the idea of abusing the actors was fun. Well, no. Buddy in fact might not have been poisoned by the makeup. He himself could have just been severely allergic to the makeup. MGM's response to the situation was actually appropriate given that in 1938, pure aluminum dust was considered harmless and was given to miners to breathe in order to protect their lungs from silicosis. There is a disease caused by inhaling aluminum, but its symptoms were different from Buddy Ebsen's reaction. MGM ended up having to replace Ebsen with Jack Haley due to the accident. And despite the confusion, MGM changed the makeup anyways, turning the aluminum powder into aluminum paste, so there was no danger of inhalation. A physician even confirmed that there is no danger of any illness from the new makeup to Jack Haley. The makeup on its own wasn't actually deadly. It was the aluminum dust that did any damage, but it should have been safe even for its time. It's likely Buddy Ebsen suffered an allergic reaction rather than makeup poisoning. Was it bad luck? Yeah, definitely. But it was an unforeseen situation and MGM reacted appropriately. Okay, so just the other day, I was again recommended a YouTube short from a YouTuber who claimed Hamilton's makeup was so dangerous because the makeup was copper. Misconception, the makeup was not copper. It was made containing copper oxide. In case you're wondering, why does that matter? It still had copper either way. It's an important technicality. The same reason why you're not going to get yourself killed with air fresheners, because they are not phthalates. They are only made with phthalates. So air fresheners are not necessarily dangerous. Or the same reason you're not going to die, because your oven cleaners are not alkalis. They are made containing alkalis. So they're not going to poison you. Or the same reason why some celebrities aren't gross for wearing ambergris. They are only wearing certain types of perfume that contains ambergris. You can look that one up. My point is, Hamilton's makeup was not copper. It was made containing copper. And that on its own wasn't a huge deal.
And they cleaned my face or whatever it was, and then they put on some sort of protective film of something. It was very, very light, and he worked that in, and then came the green, and the green had copper in it. And then they had a large wart right here, and then they had this large horsehair coming out about that far out of the wart.
What precautions did they take, and how did Hamilton feel about her makeup overall? Well, back then, standard makeup was mainly trouble with two colours, gold and green. Gold sealed up pores whilst green was toxic because it contained copper. Taking no chances anyways, the makeup was thoroughly cleaned off. The other precaution taken was when she would eat a peanut butter sandwich wrapped in wax paper, so she wouldn't ingest much of the green paint. The only time the makeup proved problematic was when they were trying to get it off after she was burned. The makeup on its own, however, generally wasn't as big of a deal as what yellow journalists have fooled you into believing. In the forward section of the book, Hamilton herself writes, "I also got used to the feeling of the green makeup as it dried on my face. It never cracked or really felt uncomfortable. The long fingernails were glued to my own. The three men had their meals compensated in exchange for them to eat privately in their dressing rooms because their makeup bothered the people around them in the commissary. They did have multiple problems, but the biggest issue they individually had to face were the following. Besides an eye infection at one point, Jack Haley remembers how sitting down was impossible. I couldn't lie down in that costume. I couldn't even sit in it. I could only lean against a reclining board. Ray Bolger had his own problems, but in hindsight, only one stood out for him.
I had a rubber mask, and it was a rubber mask. The only unfortunate thing about it was that it sort of closed the pores in my face, and when the lights got real hot and they ate up all the oxygen, I couldn't breathe. Not as easily as I possibly would like to, and if I had to make any movement, I would be constantly out of breath and my heart would be palpitating.
Besides being a walking sweaty mattress, Lars' main challenge usually was to sip lunch through a straw. His makeup wasn't toxic, but he couldn't open his mouth too widely without breaking the prosthetics. If he wanted to eat something without a straw, it meant an extra hour in the makeup chair after lunch to replace the prosthetics. Birdlaw was also known to avoid sitting in the makeup chair until exactly when he had to be in it. He dreaded the makeup. And yes, he was wearing a real lion pout. The horror of animals being a part of clothing. Some people really push the idea that Burt Lyle was practically starving 24/7 for 6 months because of this. No, sorry. He was eating, and he was allowed to eat more variety of foods. The prosthetics just had to be taken into account. Also remember, for everyone, this was only lunch. Breakfast, dinner, or any time they're not on set or in their costumes, they had no restrictions on food. These difficulties, horrors, still must have had really traumatized them though. Not really. The attitudes towards the costumes after the Wizard of Oz wrapped, I think really puts things into perspective. When asked if he would buy his costume if it was put up in the Metro auction, Haley said, "Those costumes were hell. You wanted to run away from them, not buy them. Where would I put it? Down in the basement?" In 1939, La had a change of heart towards his costume. He had a fascination with the lion skin he wore in The Wizard of Oz. He's trying to buy it from the Metro for stuffing purposes. In the 1970s Metro auction, Ray Bolger would have probably seriously considered buying his own Scarecrow costume, if he had not already owned it. It is worth noting that these are also a hint at how Haley, La, and Bolger felt about the overall production. Remember as well, the narrative is that the set was horrible for everyone, especially for Judy Garland. But despite the costumes being probably the most difficult thing about the set for the overall cast, Garland actually had it by far the best when it comes to costume. According to the 50th pictorial, the blonde wig gave her the most trouble, whilst according to Algene Harmon's account, Garland's only real physical obstacle was a binding cloth that held her breasts in. The corset was uncomfortable, but she rarely complained. Sorry, extremely uncomfortable. This is truly some horrifying stuff. So in short, the costumes and makeup was difficult. But since when is makeup not difficult? Even with the advancements made over the years, makeup can still easily be one of the worst things an actor can endure.
I think it was like around 3 hours, 30 minutes every day for the makeup, which I'm kind of used to because I did this movie called The Sea Inside and it was 5 hours makeup every day.
When I did The Grinch, I was literally, the makeup was like being buried alive every day.
How long did it take?
The first day was 8.5 hours. And I went back to my trailer and put my leg through the wall. And I told Ron Howard I couldn't do the movie. Yeah, the green yak hair that turned inward and went, It was horrifying. Wow. It was horrifying. I was just like, it's for the kids, it's for the kids, it's for the kids.
Garland had it the best as well, so it still doesn't even line up with the narrative. Although, whilst Garland by far did have the best with costume and makeup, there are those that say she had it the worst when it comes to lunch. The claim is that Judy only had drugs, 80 cigarettes a day, and chicken soup whilst making The Wizard of Oz. Regarding the cigarettes, this is the time way before the cancer information came out about cigarettes, so smoking was a normal thing for adults and adolescents.
From the time there were cigarettes, smoking cigarettes was supposed to be, at least until the 1960s when all the cancer information was posted. Smoking cigarettes was supposed to be a mark of that you were an adult.
It would not be a surprise if she did smoke some cigarettes, but there isn't any evidence to suggest she even smoked at all, especially not 80 a day. How does anyone think that's possible? Even if I was super generous and said she was trying to break a world record or something, and she smoked each cigarette in 5 minutes, that would still take her at least 6.5 hours non-stop to complete each day. Garland stated she never wanted to smoke or even drink. It doesn't help that this guy erroneously referred to Judy's costume pocket as a secret patch to conceal cigarettes.
And they wanted to see if there was that secret pocket, which we never knew about a secret pocket, a very deep pocket. And apparently Judy, even though she was so young, before we knew the hazards of smoking, she smoked at that time. And this is for her cigarettes.
What? Why would they design a pocket for her to hide a cigarette packet? That pocket was used for her handkerchief. You know the thing that she uses throughout the movie and seems to bring out of nowhere at times? Yeah, that's where she was actually storing it. Why would the costume designers add a pocket for cigarettes, as opposed to something that's actually relevant to the film and a character? Especially considering the fact that she likely wasn't much of a smoker, assuming she even did smoke. It is worth noting that yes, she was put on a diet, but it wasn't just soup she had. As far as her co-stars knew, she never complained about being starved by the studio. There are divided accounts on how much Judy was actually eating at the time, but even one account claiming she didn't have much food, even still says that she was indeed eating stuff outside of just soup. It's likely there's a grey area between the accounts where her diet was strict, but she didn't stick to it much anyway.
L. Frank Baum's granddaughter, Florence, was, I believe, 14 when Judy was making The Wizard of Oz. And as a Baum family member, she was given certain access to the set when she could get away from school. Florence went on record as saying, I was her slave. I would do anything she asked me to do. And one of the things that she asked Florence to do was go to the commissary, because Judy couldn't order this and get away with it, go to the commissary and order a double order of mashed potatoes and gravy and bring it back to Judy's dressing room. The girl was eating.
This is what Judy had to say about her diet. You know, we worked on that picture for 6 months, and even though it was the most pleasant time I've ever spent, I lost 12 pounds. So what do you think? All the game thinks I'm reducing. Gosh, maybe I should add that. but really it's only that I've grown taller and my weight is going to the right places. She has also said that now that I'm so much thinner, I love clothes. Everyone was certain that I'd be pudgy and fat. Judy laughed. I've always loved chocolate and chocolate cake and peanut butter fudge, and I was always being warned that I must not eat the things that I liked. I was the ugly duckling. Judy laughed. According to a nutritionist expert, the average safe timeline to lose 15 pounds for women is between 2 to 4 months. Garland lost 12 pounds in double that time. Not to undermine her achievement. Of course, people might be more concerned about the morality of the situation, not the practicality. And yeah, I think that's a fair thing to point out. But I'm just saying the portrayal of the situation is so much worse than the reality. The secret myth is dumb. She was allowed to eat more than just soup, regardless of how you look at it. And she had a friend who was secretly giving her the food she specifically wanted anyway. The diet itself was more than safe, and Garland had a positive look on it at the time. Regarding Judy Garland's drugs, however, that deserves its own topic of focus. The claim nowadays is that MGM forced drugs onto Garland in order to be in The Wizard of Oz. This got her addicted to drugs and overdosed on those drugs, hence which people have translated into the following. The Wizard of Oz killed Judy Garland. Yeah, sure it did. Here's the thing, the context is so much more complex. First question is, what were the drugs that Judy Garland was taking throughout her life? They were pep pills, medicine distributed to the public at the time.
The studio doctor thought, what would the harm in being putting her on Benzedrine? Brand new pill, everybody was taking it, truck drivers, writers, everybody was, what could be the harm? Well, we know now what the harm was.
One of the pills she took was Dexedrine, as it was used to suppress her appetite. While the Dexedrine provided pep, unknown was its potential for addictive misuse and adverse side effects, including paranoia and insomnia. According to Lorna Laft, no one in those days, certainly not the studio doctors prescribing them, had any idea what they were doing when they began administering amphetamines to their personnel. Nowadays, we're all familiar with the dangers of these powerfully addictive stimulants, but nobody knew the risks in 1938. In those days, Benzedrine was the new wonder drug, the brainchild of a Nobel Prize-winning scientist, and the other pill she was taking was a form of barbiturates, which were also believed to be safe at the time. A large number of Americans were taking these. Most of MGM was taking them, especially the creative heads. In fact, even Louis B. Mayer was taking these pills. So she wasn't taking evil drugs that MGM secretly forced onto her. They were pep pills that many people at the time were using, but no one knew the potential addictiveness that one can develop through them. In fact, even a couple of decades later after The Wizard of Oz, family movies were still pushing the pills as a positive option to the audience. That complicates this narrative, doesn't it? But the second big question is, when did she start taking them? It's hard to say. There are some pretty big contradictions amongst reliable sources. For example, based off of Lorna Laft's memoir, Judy likely started taking both pills in 1938, whilst Jack Haley claims the pills came in after the Wizard of Oz production.
You know, Jack Haley came out point blank in 1970 and said, Judy wasn't on pills during the Wizard of Oz. That happened later.
However, I think the quote that puts things into perspective is one that belongs to frequent co-worker and longtime friend of Judy Garland, Mickey Rooney. In his book, Life is Too Short by Mickey Rooney, he states, "Some people say the studio doped her up at this time, giving her downers at bedtime and uppers so she could get up and go to work in the morning. This was simply not true. Mom would never do this. Judy had taken to drinking, and with her drinking, sleeping pills. No one forced them on her. She was old enough to know what she was doing, but in reality, she didn't know what she was doing. She started with one, then when one didn't work, she took two. When two didn't work, she took four. When four didn't work, she took 8. And oh Christ, you'll lose count after 8. Take note as well that he says no one forced them onto her, and he emphasizes the sleeping pills, the pills that she overdosed on in the future. I find it likely she was only taking uppers at the time, but people mistakenly thought she was also taking downers as well, when they probably did come in later. That's just my guess, but some might say it doesn't matter exactly when she took them anyway. The barbiturates were used to counteract the Dexedrine, which she used for weight loss, so she could be in the Wizard of Oz. That means the Wizard of Oz really did kill Judy. No, you're missing the point. The Dexedrine as well as the barbiturates were very common at the time, and they were used by many people, even her peers and the head of MGM, Louis B. Mayer. Regardless of what movie she was making in 1938, or even if she was never on a diet, she would have been exposed to the Dexedrine anyways, because the Dexedrine wasn't just used for weight loss, it was used for pep. And many people at MGM and even the country were using it for pep. We also have Gerald Frank's account where he states, if you were up late, and Judy loved to stay up late, and had to rise early the next morning, you took the pill to get as much sleep as possible. And if, in order to wake up and function, you had to take a wake-up pill, You took a Benzodrine or the newer improved pill called Dexedrine. Everyone did. The writers, the directors, the actors. It was part of the course, of everyone's course. I cannot say confidently when she started taking them other than it was the late 1930s. But regardless, no one forced them onto her. The drugs were pet pills prescribed to her by MGM doctors that everyone else was taking as they were released to the public by an award-winning physician. You probably didn't even know that later down the track, when MGM found out she had an addiction, they actually tried the hardest to get her off the pills. But overall, blaming Judy's downfall on MGM is oversimplified and probably not even true to at least some extent. And the idea of a specific movie being the source of her problems is just stupid.
Everybody who talks about Judy said that was one of her she had great physical energy. She had great emotional energy. She would give so much of it that it would sap her strength at times, but she gave it and it was there to call upon.
Am I really doing this? Yes, the lights were bright and hot, so the fairly new Technicolor camera can properly capture the image. According to cinematographer Harold Rosson, we had an enormous bank of arc lights overhead. We borrowed every unused arc light in Hollywood. It was brutally hot. People were always fainting and being carried off the set. When he says brutally hot, which version of brutal do you think he was referring to? Do you think he meant savagely violent, i.e. a brutal murder? Or was he actually referring to the heat as simply unpleasant or harsh, i.e. the brutal morning light? Although when he says that people were always fainting, I don't know how literal that's supposed to be. The heat was an obstacle for everyone, but the only one reportedly to have really suffered from it was Bert Lahr. Rosson also says, I used to feel so sorry for the poor lion. I used to pity him so much, in that costume with the hot light beaming down on him. But when things did get too hot, however, they would open up all the doors and let everyone cool off. From what Wallace Versley recalls, air conditioning was fairly primitive at the time, even though we had the best there was. But when the lights got too hot, we would stop for 2 or 3 hours and open up all the doors to clear the set of smoke before we made the next take. I was so close to not bothering to address this. Yes, it is true the lights were hot, but how do people think of that as a horror or some kind of dark secret? The lights were hot. Big deal. Film set on stages do not have to be so bright and hot anymore, but any ambitious film still requires overcoming a lot of similar difficulties. There are plenty of film crews that shoot on location with all kinds of difficulties, including intense heat. On the Wizard of Oz set, when things did get too hot, they opened up all the doors and let everyone cool off for a while. People that go out on location, however, they don't have that luxury. They have to experience that intense heat constantly, but no one makes up horror stories about those film sets.
It was extreme, even so much that some days we had to stop shooting because the drivers couldn't see where they were going.
How bad was the heat on set really? I don't doubt that it was hot, but if it was so awfully, horribly, tortuously hot, then why is there so much visual proof of the cast and crew wearing jumpers and jackets on set? There were photos of them wearing jackets during breaks, and there's even a photo of Jack Haley wearing a bathrobe over his costume. So yes, the lights on set were hot. Moving on. The claim being that the Munchkins were up to no good. More specifically, they were always drinking and having orgies at the hotel they were staying in.
During the filming of The Wizard of Oz, most of the Munchkins stayed together at this hotel. Now, the rumor is that while they were here, they carried on in a less than civilized fashion. And in fact, Judy Garland helped to perpetuate the rumor.
Chinese.
Yeah.
Yeah. Were they little kids or were they,
They
little
were
men?
drunks.
They were little drunks? What they... What they... You got me stuttering. What did they do? What did they do?
What did they do?
What the dwarfs do?
But one of them, who was about 40, a gentleman asked me for dinner, and I couldn't say, I don't want to go out. I can't because you're midges. And I just said, no, my mother wouldn't like it. Oh, come on, bring your ma too, you know.
How big was he?
About 2 inches high.
What could you do with it?
I don't know.
What could he do? I mean...
Oh, I know. They haven't did a lot because...
There was a lot of them.
Oh, you hundreds of thousands. And they put them all in one hotel room. Not one room, one hotel in Culver City.
Yeah.
And they got smashed every night. And they'd pick them up in butterfly nets.
I'm pretty sure she's joking. Professional journalists have actually reported on this as fact. You do realize the Munchkins weren't literally 2 inches tall. Butterfly nets are really small because they're for butterflies.
As much I love Judy, when she made that statement on Jack Parr's show, Judy had a couple of belts in her.
And she was trying to be funny. And when you're trying to be funny and you don't know what to say, you're going to pick on the little people.
However, some others thought of the Munchkins as drunks as well. As Wallace Worsley recalls, oh lord, they were a mixed breed. A limousine would drive up and they'd take about 12 or 14 of them, and the doors would open up and they'd tumble out in the morning. And some of them were drunk, and some of them hadn't been to sleep all night. Take note of how often he said some though. They've also been accused of having sex orgies at the hotel. The most obvious question that I've seen no one ask is, if they did have orgies at the hotel, did they do it in public? Were the Munchkins open about their sexual activity? For some reason, I doubt that.
Rumors of sex orgies.
Oh, that's a lot of BS. I mean, that makes good copy, you know.
Here's the thing though, they didn't have orgies at all. It's actually a misunderstanding. Nearly all the midgets were hyperpituitary dwarves, men and women whose pituitary glands did not function properly, deficient in growth hormone. Yet midgets are most often not oversexed but undersexed. A reasonably large number of the hyperpituitary people are sexually immature because they have multiple pituitary hormone disorders, says Dr. S. Douglas Fraser. Hyperpituitary dwarves tend to go into puberty late and to grow slowly, quarter inch by quarter inch, until they are 25 or 30 years old. According to Yip Harburg, the Munchkins were a pretty noisy bunch. Why the employers misjudged their noise and quarrels and childish tantrums as depravity can only be guessed at. Perhaps it was that, being deviant in one way, they were automatically assumed to be deviant in all.
Jerry, you were saying that you shared your bed with two other guys.
Well, we had a full-size bed.
And you shared that?
Yeah.
I see.
It seems
we
to
had
me...
a full-size bed too, but there were three of us.
So the sounds being misinterpreted as oversexed midgets having orgies was actually noises of tantrums and other childish related noises due to the lack of maturity development. MGM contract player Ann Rutherford summarized the situation. You get that many of anybody together, you have a few that are off center, they give the whole bunch a bad name. They had such enthusiasm because they had never encountered anything like the glamour of a studio. In regards to anything serious, only one thing has been reported to happen involving a knife threat, but that was also off the set and it was dealt with.
There was a little incident about one of the Munchkins got a little jealous about his ex-wife and threatened somebody with a knife.
The little people were excited about coming to Hollywood, and some did get a bit carried away at times, but the majority overall were more often than not behaved. There was, in actuality, very little trouble. The Munchkins were timid more than aggressive, shy more often than bold. So out of the 124 midgets, there were a handful that did like to drink off set. The orgy didn't happen at all. If anything, they were more likely undersexed. So this myth is based off of rumors and generalizations when in reality, it was just a few midgets drinking out of an overall well-behaved bunch. However, this is not the end of the Munchkin myths, as a relatively new claim against the Munchkins has been brought up recently, where they supposedly molested the one and only Judy Garland, and apparently she has said this herself. Before I break down the specific quotes and the origin of this myth, here's the general overview to why this myth makes no sense. Even to this day, there are articles that use the Munchkin orgies as proof for the molestation taking place, despite it already being addressed and debunked decades ago. The other thing too is, every account from the people that worked on the set and talked about the Munchkins, good or bad, not a single one of them mentioned about the Munchkins being sexually aggressive on set, and not a single one of them mentioned anything about them harming Judy. Remember as well, Judy's time was limited with the Munchkins due to child labor laws.
Whenever she was out of school, she was on the set, but then as soon as they finished, she was back at school. And that's the way it is with all studio children actors and actresses.
And in Karen Marshall's book, she has this interaction with the Munchkins, where she asked, "Where do you eat? I've never seen any of you in the commissary. Our lunch is catered to us on the soundstage next door. That's why you never see us." Karen Marshall had multiple lunches with Judy and she didn't notice the Munchkins at all, let alone any of them bothering her. And Judy had a security guard that took her between the film sets and her school.
She would come in with a security guard into the studio, see? And the director told us later on, he says, all the young people that's 15, 16 years old that we use in pictures, men or women or girls and boys, we have security guards for them. The reason for that, so when they get outside, there are no smart alecks that try to take over and hurt them or do anything bad to them.
So the Munchkins had no chance to molest Judy anywhere, unless it was on the set with all the cast and crew, typically when they're ready to do a take. There was no way that would have gone unnoticed. Statistically, male Munchkins that were 40 or more years old only made up about 10% of the group. That is a lot of Munchkins that stood by and did nothing.
After work, let's go out and play a little, baby. How'd you like to have a good time? How'd you like to have? Let's go out and have a little fun. Play yourself. Oh, what do you say? All right. Hey, come on, that's enough, Billy. Come on, get out of here. Let's go. Come on. Out you go.
Thanks. Forget it.
Yellow journalists want to believe that every little person was the same. That means they were all willing to molest her. Because they aren't individual people, they are all the same. If you made that kind of unfair generalization against someone's gender or race, you'd be torn to shreds, and rightfully so. But extreme generalizations against people with a growth deficiency, that's considered acceptable, I guess. So apparently, yeah, they're all the same, hence why no one was willing to stand up for Judy, including all the female Munchkins. Speaking of which, you know there were other female crew members on the Wizard of Oz set, and there were female cast members too on the Munchkin set. I counted all the times they claimed to have experienced any sexual abuse. Ready? There was not a single quote on the matter from Margaret Hamilton. There was not a single quote on the matter from Billy Burke. And there's not a single quote on the matter from Karen Marshall. However, if you change the question from did they experience sexual abuse to did they witness it, you might find that the answers are a bit different. Perhaps not. Yeah, there was nothing to indicate these female casts were aware of any sexual aggression on set. Not from the Munchkins or anything against Judy. In fact, there's evidence to contradict that idea. There's a quote from Billy Burke in her own biography expressing how positively she felt about the production overall, which I will reveal later. Not only Karen Marshall didn't mention anything negative about the Munchkins, she actually remembers very fondly of them.
She said, well, we have a Wizard of Oz festival, and I heard you were Judy's stand-in, and we'd like to have you come. The first thing I said, will the Munchkins be there? Because I love those little people. It was my favorite set.
We also have Algene Harmet's book, where she addresses the oversexed Munchkin myth as false, and explains how the myth started in the first place. This also is approved by Margaret Hamilton. Hamilton herself even says that Judy on set was one of the happiest people I've ever seen. So I guess Judy did tell Hamilton she was molested, but Hamilton and Harmet tried to cover it up. Or is it more logical to say that Hamilton wasn't aware of it at all, and Judy didn't mention anything, despite the fact Hamilton definitely would have noticed something, and if there was one person Judy was going to tell anyone about the situation on the Munchkin set, it would have been Hamilton. But she didn't. Even Hamilton didn't protect Judy from harm. I do not believe that at all. There were also many celebrity guests, and none of them has said anything on the matter, including Mickey Rooney. So I guess Rooney was also aware of the Munchkins molesting his dear friend, but not only he didn't care, he congratulated them for it.
Jack, you were actually on the set, right? Your dad took you on.
I was about 5 years old, and he had to go out one day and do some pre-recording because he was new to the picture, and so he left me with her mother, and poured me tea in the dressing room. But the sight of that set was just unbelievable. The colors, it was Munchkin Land was the set he took me to.
You saw the original Munchkin.
Yeah, and he thought it was
I gather a lot of the Munchkin people were quite sexy and were pinching each other and doing all kinds of... No, this is totally not
myth.
Yeah.
Bad myth.
Judy did not tell a single soul to anyone on set, and even the most extreme myths about the Munchkins had nothing to do with Judy. And the only serious incident that evidently did happen was reported off-set, and again, it had nothing to do with Judy Garland.
Judy never said they fondled my skirt, the hem of my skirt. Judy never said they backed me into a corner. Judy said that one of them asked her to dinner. That's as far as it went.
If Judy being molested was a cover-up that they kept a secret for decades, that wasn't even kept a secret at the time. It actually broke out very quickly after it happened. Although if the relationship between the Munchkins and Judy wasn't sexually abusive, what kind of relationship did they have? It appears they had a normal, healthy working relationship. The most common story that they told was about how after her stardom ceremony, Judy gave all the Munchkins Christmas presents that she could afford to get them.
Chocolate!
One of them was chocolates, but the other was autographed pictures of her. Not just generic autographs, but ones with personal messages to each of them individually.
My most treasured possession is a personally autographed picture from Judy in which she says, "To mine heart, a perfect corner and person too, love from Judy."
If this myth is so fake and there's tons of evidence against it, why did Judy say it? Well, she likely didn't. The thing is, Judy herself liked to make up stories, including dark, harrowing ones. But even then, many people have expanded on her stories further, and not all of her husbands were an exception.
I heard recently that you no longer sing Over the Rainbow. I hope that's not true.
Of course it's not true. That's the best song ever written.
Now, someone had said Judy Garland isn't singing Over the Rainbow.
Now, who said that?
And a reporter, and I just heard it last
Really?
week.
And what does his wife do, sing?
I think she sings Over the Rainbow.
She probably...
The one who started this molestation craze was Judy Garland's third husband, Sid Luft, and this section of the book is what many have been obsessing over. So yeah, they reached under her dress, made her feel miserable, but she didn't think it was worth telling anyone on set, or even in her lifetime, other than her savior, Sid Luft. And no one noticed or said, oh, you get the point.
And they swore by Judy Garland. They loved her. Nobody would have let Munchkin gentlemen bother, never mind molest, a 16-year-old girl on the set.
So why did Sid say this? Shock value and money are definitely likely reasons, particularly this part where he emphasized not just the age difference between Judy and the little people, but also Dorothy the character. Do you think Judy naturally said this in the moment when she told the story to Sid? Or is this Sid Luft's addition to create a more outrageous reaction from the audience? Although another factor could be Sid Luft's receding memory.
Sid tried to write a book at least 4 different times from the 60s into the early 2000s, and different writers. I was asked to vet the first part of a manuscript that he submitted. It had been sold to a publisher here in New York, and I was known there, and they said, will you come and look at this? And it was about 1990, and he didn't remember his own life that well at that point. He had remembered when he talked to Gerald Frank for that book in the early 70s more clearly.
Coincidentally, Gerald Frank's book is the only other account where it mentions Judy being touched inappropriately, although it leans towards fake more than anything else, in which it says, the men, she was to say later, pinched her when she passed by. There was a folklore which held that midgets possess unusual sexual prowess, and they took advantage of this, she said, propositioning it on the slightest pretext. Gerald Frank says that this claim was based off of a folklore, as in a body of popular myths or beliefs relating to a particular place, activity, or group of people. This is also coming from the same book that says, Judy was not an accurate source with respect to herself. She exaggerated outrageously, invented gleefully, and over the years changed her stories. Eugene Harmon's book came out a few years later, where the oversexed Munchkin myth is explicitly debunked. Gerald Frank also says that this was something Judy said later in her life, which was when she was more likely to make up outrageous stories. However, it also happens that Sid Luft had almost no involvement with Judy until later in her life. Here's the thing as well, for a few reasons, I believe this claim was actually contributed to Gerald Frank's book by none other than Sid Luft. And if we take another look at his book, I think Sid Luft, although probably unintentionally, dropped some clues that this was one of Judy's stories. Everyone is so focused on the Munchkin molestation claim, but no one has paid attention to the context surrounding it. Sid Luft mentions that he and Judy were drinking champagne when she made this claim, and after the claim, he says, the little girl-woman dilemma would subtly emerge in so many of Judy's stories, and I was to experience in her very behavior as well.
Judy had a couple of belts in her, and she was trying to be funny.
So where did the story really come from? Even if Judy did say anything about being inappropriately touched, it was this. But she only told it to Sid Luft because she wanted to entertain him with a story and take his mind off of their current situation. And she was also drinking, which didn't help. The story has essentially been addressed and debunked by credible sources. Sid Luft then expanded on the story because of his receding memory, as well as the shock value to get his book out there that he was struggling to get published for decades. It went from Judy getting pinched by the Munchkins and their sexual prowess being the main cause, to the Munchkins reaching under her dress, Judy pinching herself, and the blame is on their drinking habit. Sid Luft should have never been relied on as a trustworthy source, especially not in comparison to more reliable sources, such as Karen Marshall.
I love those little people. It was my favorite set.
Margaret Hamilton, and Jack Haley Jr.
People were quite sexy and were pinching each other and doing all kinds of... No, this is totally not
myth.
True. Yeah.
Bad myth.
No, wait a second. We have another thing.
No. Yeah. And Judy.
They all have lawyers. They all have lawyers. Well, anyway.
Well, the story. Never mind.
Well, anyway.
Well, the story. Never mind.
My mom would embellish on stories that she knew would make an audience laugh. Did they happen? Maybe not. She was on the Jack Parr show and she embellished on a story about the Munchkins being drunk, and that didn't happen. My mom embellished on that story because it made people laugh.
I'll go back to the Munchkins for just a minute, because of course that started from Judy's carefree anecdote on the Jack Parr show on a night when she was not in great shape, but she was funny, true to her tradition, and she was being funny. She was there to be funny. Then dear beloved, kindly, sweet, wholesome Sid Luft in his memoirs, or as they were rewritten by his henchmen, elaborated on them.
The only other quote I found regarding the Munchkin molestation was this. Don't know where it comes from. From the articles I've read, they associate this quote with either Sid Luft's book or IMDb quotes, which for their own reasons are both invalid sources. Journalists actually spread this around like it's fact. Based off of this, the Munchkins didn't reach under her dress with their hands. They actually snuck under her dress. I should not have to say this, but the Munchkins aren't actually so small to the point they can be picked up with butterfly nets, and they're not actually so small to the point where they can sneak under her dress undetected. Apparently she would get them into trouble if she found out about them sneaking under her dress. Considering there's no evidence of her dobbing on the Munchkins for such a claim, it's evident this did not happen. It makes no sense as well. If the Munchkins did go under her dress, how did she not always know about it? She did not feel them or the weight of her dress being lifted. It doesn't make sense, but people believe this quote and the stuff Sid Luft says out of all people because it makes a good story. And that's the Wizard of Oz horror stories in a nutshell. A lot of these dark secrets do not make any sense whatsoever, and they contradict each other as well. But many people blindly believe them simply because they make good stories.
Rumors of sex orgies.
Oh, that's a lot of BS. I mean, that makes good copy, you know.
I wasn't interested enough to get out a magnifier and check the validity. I bought it. Good story.
Whose fault was it that made these ghost stories so popular? At first glance, the answer appears to be Judy Garland. A lot of the myths stem from her outrageous stories. She made up all kinds of stories that did appear to have inspired the myths, especially in the 60s. A lot of them contradict her previous statements, and statements from other sources. So, are the horror stories her fault? Well, no. She made up a lot of things for various reasons, but for the most part, she was just telling stories to entertain her audience, and the people around her. Any person that says Judy said it herself as a way to justify any of these ghost stories about the set are essentially admitting they have done absolutely no research whatsoever. And if they claim to have done research, then they are lying to you.
When you hear people say, oh, I knew Judy and she was tragic, they're lying. They didn't know her and she wasn't tragic.
Because the fact that she loved to make up stories, including dark harrowing ones, was by far one of the most common facts I found about her.
All right, she was truly hilarious.
Very dark. She had a very dark sense of humor.
Yes.
The other common fact I found about her was how much she loved to laugh. And she has said many positive things about the set and MGM overall even later in her life. So no, I do not blame Judy Garland for the ghost stories surrounding the Wizard of Oz set. At one point, I actually thought it might have been Algene Harmitz's fault. How she portrayed a lot of the information in this book was a bit confusing. From what I have heard, she didn't write this book necessarily as a Wizard of Oz fan. That's completely fine. Her detachment from the film could have given us, in some ways, a more objective point of view. But I think she went too far in the opposite direction. I think she was actually too apathetic and ended up presenting events to be more hellish than they actually were.
3 dirty hams! Let that little girl in there.
Got smashed every night, and they'd pick them up in butterfly nets.
There was this woman wrote a book back in the 70s called The Making of the Wizard of Oz, and she had some sort of an agenda. Her basic thesis was that the Wizard of Oz didn't do well, that the critics didn't like it. I researched it very deeply. We found 80 great reviews that the film got in 1939. The only 3 negative ones it got were the ones she had made a great deal of in her book.
There's one in particular where she says, from October 12th, 1938 to March 16th, 1939, Ray Bolger, Jack Haley, Burt Lahr, Margaret Hamilton, and Judy Garland lived within the confines of a nightmare, in which they were joined occasionally by Billy Burke, Frank Morgan, and 124 midgets. Time has not softened the edges of the bad dream. The survivors still look back on that endless fall, and blah blah blah. It's a bit much. This wasn't the introduction to the book, it was the introduction to Chapter 6, Stars and Stand-ins. The main focus of that chapter was the makeup and costumes, which were the most difficult things for the overall cast to endure. So this kinda made sense, but still a very over-the-top introduction. Still, even though Harmits appears to be too apathetic at times in a book, there's still a lot of great information that should have cleared up a lot of the Wizard of Oz horror myths by now, but they haven't. So despite her questionable approach to the book, the Wizard of Oz horror stories were not her fault either. So how come there's still so many ghost stories spreading around the film? Well, I'll give you a clue. Who has told you that this book confirms the Munchkin myths, despite the fact it actually addresses them as misconceptions? Who has told you that Judy's stories were real, despite every credible source saying the opposite?
I mean, people believe a lot of the things that she has told.
Who has told you that the director's slap was the standard, not the exception? Who keeps telling you that the snow was asbestos, even though it wasn't? Who keeps telling you that the makeup was dangerous, even though generally they were actually safe to wear, and they were the standard for the industry?
And they cleaned my face or whatever it was, and then they put on some sort of protective film of something. And it was very, very light, and he worked that in.
Who keeps saying that this Munchkin myth is real, where an extreme action went unnoticed by everyone on set, and no credible sources have ever confirmed this? And who keeps telling you that this Munchkin myth is real, where an extreme action went unnoticed by everyone on set, and no credible sources has ever confirmed this? Who keeps telling you that heat, accidents, stunts, horrible makeup are exclusive examples of the Wizard of Oz set being a literal nightmare, as opposed to being challenges that many films typically face? And who continuously refuses to provide you the proper context for all this, and tries to portray everything as an over-the-top ghost story? Yellow journalists. Yellow journalists do not care if the information they provide is true or in any way accurate. They only care about the reception they receive for the articles. I believe there's a hierarchy when it comes to authentic information. Primary sources and people experiencing the event at first hand are generally at the top, and people with connections are just beneath them. Although there can be contradictions even amongst reliable sources, there's usually an answer somewhere in the grey area if you compare perspectives between those reliable sources. On the very bottom of the list, we have the most unreliable, bottom of the barrel garbage that should be avoided like the plague. Because here's the thing with yellow journalists, they don't compare perspectives or try to find out the truth. They cherry pick one or two quotes and then add their own context to it. Other yellow journalists then extracts that version of the information. Then it gets passed down further until it becomes something completely different and something much more clickbaity. Yellow journalists source other yellow journalists, and whenever they do extract something from the reliable sources, it's just so that they can twist around more information, reveal more dark secrets, so they can pretend the article has exclusive, shocking information and is worth clicking on. So how do you spot a yellow journalist? When you're watching or reading someone's article, ask yourself the following questions. Does the journalist have credibility on the subject? If not, do they have credible sources? Does the journalist report accurately based off of the original source? And does the quality and/or quantity of the evidence match with the severity of the claims? If the answer is no to most, if not all these questions, then they are not worth listening to. John Fricke has said how much he hated it when people twist around the information.
Those comments have been misquoted and misprinted and draped in crepe and all the rest of it.
And just a few months after this podcast, there was another Wizard of Oz horror video that came out, in which they used yellow journalist sources, except for one source. Guess what that was? Despite this, who have people trusted more with the information? The expert who co-wrote the book, or the yellow journalist telling ghost stories? It's ridiculous. The average viewer that is repeatedly exposed to this yellow journalist narrative then thinks that this version of the events is the most accurate because of the repetition by the media, and it comes to the point that the original information that was told by the reliable source is dismissed as a positive perspective. Yes, really. I have actually shown some people some of this evidence before, but they dismiss it as being positive, and they'd rather believe the yellow journalist's interpretation of that same information. There's a publicly released outtake of Judy Garland sneezing during Over the Rainbow, and another outtake where she intentionally stops in the middle of it because she wanted to start over and do a better take. But there are those that still believe Judy had no energy, and she was not allowed to make mistakes without being abused. The Margaret and Judy interview mentioned their friendship with the others, but there was a comment on that video claiming Margaret was her only friend. Even this footage, I remember had YouTube comments with something on the lines of, "You'd never know how awful it was to make this film by watching these clips." I am not kidding. The yellow journalistic plague has settled in so much to the point where primary sources, visual evidence at the time of the cast having fun and goofing around, is not enough to show that the costumes, interactions, or the set overall were not as bad as what many people think. People don't look at this footage and then maybe question the Yellow journalistic narrative. They let the context invented by the Yellow journalists bleed over into the evidence. Multiple films have been referred to as a troubled production, but why is the Wizard of Oz set specifically referred to as a horror-filled production? Because it makes a good story. And what makes a good story is contrast. You take something and combine it with a contradiction or an ironic twist. The idea of a horror film or a serious film having a horrible production, it doesn't stand out as much as the idea of a family movie having a horror set. And not just any family movie, the most popular and beloved family film of all time. It's the most recognizable standalone film. Yellow journalists twisted around into something more dark and serious, because that's essentially how everything is done these days. The information surrounding the Wizard of Oz as well is also just the easiest to manipulate into something horrifyingly clickbaity. As a film made in the late 1930s, and with multiple stories being told by a star, with a very complex perspective on things, there's important information that the average person is oblivious to, important context required to truly understand the feeling of being on the set of the film. Yellow journalists know this, and they realize they can twist the Oz information around to however they see fit, and whatever's the most clickbaity. All they have to do is deny you that context. You get as much information as you put into the research. If your go-to for research are unsourced YouTube shorts, then the value of your knowledge will never be worth more than the value of unsourced YouTube shorts. The simple vaccine for this is common sense and a bit of research from credible sources. But most people don't want to know the real story, only the stories that sound more over the top and engaging. People become infected with misinformation, and they spread that misinformation thinking it's true, no matter how stupid the stories are, rewriting history until it becomes something that it never was. And that is the plague of yellow journalism. This is not to say that the set wasn't troubled at all. It was, just not in the way yellow journalists present it. If you want to know the real story, all the troubles of the film set and the things that the actors didn't like, as well as all the good things about the set that the cast cherished throughout their lives, then learn it from the people that know what they're talking about. Let's take Eugene Harmon's expression to the test and see how much of a nightmare the set really was. There was so much to go on with the Wizard of Oz set and how the cast felt about it, but I'm just going to choose one quote that I believe best represents each actor. Starting with the Munchkins.
When it was over, I wished that I could stay a little bit longer because I was enjoying myself.
Yeah, the little people were excited about coming to Hollywood, and some of them got to stay in Hollywood long after Oz wrapped.
Trumpeter!
Right.
In the Munchkin Land sequence.
Right.
And he sings, "We're off to see the wizard." Would you like to hear it?
Frank Morgan. Yeah, it's kind of strange how the actor who plays the most characters, including the title role, is never really mentioned when it comes to the ghost stories, huh? But he was very enthusiastic for the picture. According to Noel Langley, Frank Morgan was not even third choice for the role. He begged for it. He said, "Let me go onto stage and do an ad-lib test." He did all the scenes as they were in the script. He knew the script backward. He did it all by himself with nobody there, but himself and an assistant director. Harburg and Allen and Fried and I watched the test afterward. It was marvelous. Billy Burke says, "My favorite role was in The Wizard of Oz, directed by the great Victor Fleming, in which I played Glinda, the Good Fairy. I never played such a being on stage, but this role is as close as I have come in motion pictures to the kind of parts I did in the theater." Margaret in general had her gripes with MGM, I mean, who could blame her? But despite this, even she looked back on the set fondly. There were those that claimed The Wizard of Oz and MGM ruined her acting career. Far from it. She still had stable work years after The Wizard of Oz. The Wizard of Oz was kind of just another job to her, but a very fantastical one. From the other makeup chairs came greetings from my fellow actors, who had become such an integral part of my life for the next 23 weeks. Because of the fantasy-like nature of the work, the sense of being on a ship and separated from the mainstream of life would become even greater than usual. Hamilton loved to embrace her iconic role. That's why you've likely seen her in guest appearances as the Wicked Witch in shows like Mr. Rogers and Sesame Street, and probably others you have not heard about.
How about Hansel and Gretel?
We were framed.
And what about Dorothy and her little dog Tub-Tub in The Wizard of Oz?
She asked for it. And her little dog, too.
The Wicked Witch and Witchy Pooh in the same room together. Why have I not seen this before? Brodart did express his issues with the film over the years, but later when asked if he regretted the role, he replied, "I don't regret the role at all. When you play a part like that, it brings you awfully close to the public. People feel they know you personally." If there was one actor who would have justified Eugene Harmon's expression, it would have been Jack Haley.
So it must have been fun making that picture. It was not fun like hell. It was fun. It was a lot of hard work. It was not fun at all.
He did complain a lot about the film set over the years, and even referred to it as the most horrendous job, but it was just another job to him. He did complain for a long time, but eventually even he softened up about Oz, and appreciated the immortality from it. The other 49 pictures are made, who ever heard of them? But when I'm dead and gone, the Wizard of Oz will be forever. Ray Bolger was always grateful for the immortality that Oz gave him, and just like Margaret Hamilton, he embraced it a lot down the track. I always felt that if there was a fantasy that would live, it would be this one. Not everybody could say they belong to a classic. If you want to know what Judy thought about The Wizard of Oz, I've already spoiled it. She also expressed how much she loved making the film in other ways, but there's one quote I think I should share with you, because the film wasn't just a pleasant experience, it was very important to her, especially Over the Rainbow. Over the Rainbow is kind of sacred. I don't want anybody anywhere to lose the thing they have about Dorothy and that song. Despite popular opinion, Judy did not have a tragic life and a horrible time in The Wizard of Oz. She had a very complex life, and The Wizard of Oz was one of the best things about it. It is sad that her life was cut short, but she lived and achieved more in 47 years than what most people could hope to achieve in 100. Judy herself and the people surrounding her have said it so many times that she was a lot more happy than what the media present her as. The Yellow journalist refused to tell you because
She was laughing at something that... I said, why do so many people think you're unhappy, Mama? And she said, because they need to.
I think the one thing that I don't like is that myth that she was this tragic figure, that she was always waking up, crying, and she was this poor little tragic figure, and she was just so tragic and tragic. She hated that, and we hate that.
I don't want them to say, poor, poor Judy, right after I've triumphed at the Palladium in London.
She was just like a little girl from Kansas. And we respected her because she did her job so well. It wasn't an unhappy set.
When she first came on and said, hi guys, hi kids, she was excited to see us as much as we were excited to see her.
She gave it, and it was there to call upon. They all say no, that this wasn't artificial. This was her own joy.
So if they would say, oh, your mother's a drunk, or your mother's a this, that, I'd come home in tears. And she'd say, tell them that they're a big square. And then tell them, and then don't say anything. She said, let the legend build. Let it build. It doesn't matter. The set was troubled, don't get me wrong, and not every fact about The Wizard of Oz would leave a smile on your face. Examples including how come Judy never felt beautiful, what were the other accidents that happened on set, the questionable methods MGM did have in general, and the other problems with the costumes. But there's so many other facts that would fascinate you. Like, what was the big coincidence that happened on set which you might have already been aware of? And what were the creative choices Jack Haley contributed for the picture? What did Judy do for Victor Fleming before he left the production? And there's a story about a wardrobe person that mistakenly thought an adult Munchkin was a child. How they discovered the Munchkin was actually an adult is one of the funniest things I've ever read. The set was going to be shut down, not because of some abusive nightmare over-the-top yellow journalistic crap, but because it was assumed it would never get finished. It was way over budget and behind schedule. But what saved the film was the kidding and clowning, coupled with the dedication and enthusiasm of cast and crew. The director was a special catalyst. Obstacles make for a better picture, was Fleming's stated motto. So with all this, does the Wizard of Oz set sound like a horror-filled production to you? All the myths surrounding the film are completely false or at best half-truths. The cast overall look back fondly of their experience. The person that complained the most still had positive things to say about his time on the production, and the person who deserved to complain the most actually wanted to embrace the time on the set more than anything else. And the reason why we ended up receiving this timeless classic was because of the enthusiasm and camaraderie amongst the cast and crew. There was so much more to say, but I encourage you to research yourself. Watching random videos with over-the-top titles does not count as research, including this one. I don't speak on behalf of these credible sources. Everything I have shown you is the best way I've interpreted all the information. That doesn't mean I've gotten everything right, but I've not touched yellow journalist sources. The Wizard of Oz horror myths did not start with me, and they will not end with me. They started with yellow journalists with their personal agenda, and they'll end with you rejecting them by showing that you are more interested in the truth, not these ghost stories. Letting this plague of misinformation spread means that journalistic integrity dies, the history of the filmmaking dies, and it's where the memories of Judy Garland, the real Judy Garland, dies.
This business of anybody implying that I'm either addicted to carpets or drinking or pills, I wouldn't have had time to learn a song if I'd have been as sick as they've printed me all the time. But the newspaper, the scandal sheet, sells $2 million. I mean, 2 million copies, or maybe makes $2 million just with the front page. Judy Garland admits she's broke. And then it's all in quotes by a man that you've never, pardon me, darling, that I've never met. They must be stopped. That must be stopped. I want the money, I want a public apology, and I want them to be taken to court.
You know, just about the making of The Wizard of Oz and what the drama alone would make a wonderful...
We've actually talked about that, Peter, and it's interesting. I would love to see The Road to Oz adapted as a mini-series or, an ongoing series.
And like I said, this is the remastered version. Now they say it's a bird. And in the original version, it straight up looks like a munchkin. Like a munchkin. Munchkin.
But some people without brains do an awful lot of talking, don't they?